Welcome, historians. Today you will be able to identify primary and secondary sources. Primary sources are the most important original places, people, and things from which information comes. Secondary sources are sources of less importance. Turn to page 8 in your book. At the top of page 8, it says, "What kinds of evidence do you use?" What are sources? Historians use two kinds of sources of evidence when they investigate. They need secondary sources, like books, to find out what kinds of questions other historians have already explored. They also need to see primary sources that supply the real evidence of the past. The historic photographs of the Capitol that you saw on page 5 are one example of a primary source. Historians investigate many secondary and primary sources because they need to study the past event from many points of view. Only then can historians decide how they want to explain the past. On this page and the following, you'll see some examples of primary sources historians used to write the chapters in this book. You'll discover many other primary sources as you read. Primary sources come in many forms. Not all are written materials. You'll want to look at all the sources on the page before you read the text. Looking at the source will give you lots of clues to the story itself. Boys and girls, look at the picture on the left. At the top it says Camp Randall and has two flags. The caption says, "A Wisconsin soldier wrote this letter during the Civil War." Letters are primary sources that let us see the exact words of people writing about their experiences at the time they occurred. The spearheads, or spear points, on the right say these two spear points are artifacts. Each was made and used by a different group of early Indians who lived in Wisconsin thousands of years ago. Artifacts are primary sources that give us a chance to look at something made by people who lived in the past. Now look at page 9. Here are some more sources. The letter on the left says, "This writing is in French from a page in the journal of Jacques Marquette. He wrote about his travels in Wisconsin over 300 years ago. He was one of the first non-Indians to travel through Wisconsin. Journals make a perfect primary source. They contain the exact words of people describing events in the lives at the time the events occurred." Then in the middle at the top, this historic map dates from 1848, the year Wisconsin became a state. A historic map is a really useful primary source or primary resource when you compare it with the most recent map of the same area. Below that is a card, and there's a picture of a little girl on the card. This card belonged to Mai Young Zhang, who came to Wisconsin in the 1980s. The card is an example of a government document, another excellent primary source. This building is St. Augustine's Roman Catholic Church near the town of New Diggings. It was built in 1844 before Wisconsin became a state. Buildings are another primary source. They tell us about the people who built and used them. Sometimes historic buildings are open to the public so you can visit them. This notice for a runaway slave appeared in a Missouri newspaper in 1852. Newspapers from the past are primary sources that tell us what people at the time were thinking about and events going on around them. Take a look at the primary sources on this page. Now turn to page 10. The top of page 10 says, how do historians use evidence to write history? How do historians and you ask questions of primary sources? On page 6 and 7, you learned about the thinking like a historian chart. Now you'll see the way historians use questions to begin to investigate some of the primary sources you saw on the last 2 pages. Remember, historians are always asking themselves, how can this primary source help me better understand this particular time in the past? You'll probably have more questions of your own to ask. You'll see all of these sources again later in the book. Then you can see if your questions are answered or if you still want to investigate more on your own. For example, take these spear points. Who made these spear points? When were they made? How were they made? Why are they different sizes and shapes? What kinds of stones are they made from? Are both made from the same kind of stone? Where did the stone come from? Did both kinds of stone come from the same place? Where were these spear points found? Were they both found in the same place? Who found them? When were they found? How old are they? Is one older than the other? What can they tell us about Wisconsin? Now think for a second, boys and girls. Are there any other questions that you could come up with right now? Now let's take a look at page 11. And these are some of the primary sources that we looked at on page 9. The letter that has the words Camp Randall on the top. Some of the questions about this could be, who wrote this letter? When did he write it? Where did he come from? How old was he? Who was he writing to? Why was he writing? What was he describing in this letter? And what does the letter tell us about Wisconsin at the time it was written? Look at the top right with the child sponsorship card. Who is Mai Ya Zhang? What is a sponsorship card? Why did Mai Ya need this card? Why was Mai Ya holding a big card with a number on it? What was a Hmong hill tribe from Laos? What does this card tell us about Mai Ya? Does the card have anything to do with Wisconsin in 1984? And finally, the newspaper article below that. Who was B.S. Garland? Why did he own a slave named Joshua? Where did they live? Why was B.S. Garland willing to pay a reward? Why did this notice appear in the newspaper? How does this newspaper notice help us understand what was going on in Missouri in 1852? What does this newspaper notice have to do with Wisconsin history? I know it's tempting to try and answer these questions right now, but instead of doing that, try and think if you can think of any more questions that have to do with any of these primary sources. Boys and girls, today we're going to work on a sheet called primary or secondary, and we're going to decide if some of the sources on this sheet are primary or secondary. I want you to remember that primary sources are people, places, or things that are actually from a time period. Secondary sources are photographs of things from that time period or things written about that time period. So we're going to do a little bit of practice before we get started with this sheet. Then you will get your sheet and you will complete it with a partner. If you finish early, you may get a Chromebook and view the Wisconsin Symbols presentation on Google Classroom. Let's make it a great day.